Unit 5 of the first module elaborates on the various gender issues prevalent in disaster situations, why they are vulnerable, and what are the challenges and concerns faced by them. Gender based issues lead to inequalities between women and men in several spheres. There are disparities in education, skills, pay, assets, access to resources, and information, resulting in women and girls having an overall lower status in society. This often leads to unequal distribution of power, economic opportunities, and agency, almost always disfavoring women and girls. The United Nations Charter of 1945 and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 highlighted and addressed this issue and established the first official worldwide recognition of women's equality and non-discrimination on the basis of sex. Although it is often assumed that all members of a population are exposed to a disaster risk, experience the impact of disasters in the same way. However, disaster impacts depend on how a person is exposed to risk, their vulnerabilities, and capacities. Also, the ability to prepare for disasters to reduce disaster risk depend on how a person is exposed to the risk, their vulnerabilities, and capacities. Therefore, vulnerabilities differ for men, women, boys, girls, aged persons with disabilities, and people with different levels of capacity. In day-to-day life, gender-based inequalities in society extend and get reflected in all aspects of disasters. Socially constructed roles, life experiences, norms, and values determine how women and men prepare for, react to, get affected, and recover from disasters. Disaster impacts, therefore, are not gender neutral. Women, men, girls, and boys get affected differently due to gender inequalities caused by socioeconomic conditions, gender based social and cultural beliefs, and traditional practices, which repeatedly position females at a disadvantage. Gender based economic, political, and social disparities that are prevalent in society get further exacerbated in disaster context in all stages of a disaster cycle. Patterns of gender based inequalities can be observed in several spheres broadly in economic, social, and political, as shown in this visual. Inequalities in political power and representations shows that women are often underrepresented in formal decision-making structures including governments, community councils, and policy-making institutions. Inequalities in economic participation and opportunities is reflected in most countries as women and men are distributed differently across sectors. Women are receiving lower wages for similar work, are more likely to be in low paid jobs and unsecured work, such as part time, temporary, or home based, and are more likely to have less access than men to productive assets such as education, skills, property, and credit. Educational attainment means that in most countries, women have lower literacy rates, lower levels of enrollment in primary, secondary, and tertiary education. Sexual and domestic violence is another form of gender based inequality. Women tend to be more often victims of domestic violence by women's intimate partners, sexual exploitations through trafficking and sex trade, in wars by an enemy army as a weapon of attempted ethnic cleansing, and etc. Differences in legal status and entitlements. There are many instances in which equal rights to personal status, security, land, inheritance, and employment opportunities are denied to women by law or practice. While the specific nature and level of inequalities may differ in different countries, the patterns of these inequalities mostly remains the same. The outcome of the gender-based inequalities in the social, cultural, economic, and political spheres include overall negative perceptions on girls and women as weak, incapacitated, burdensome, unable to handle complex situations. These negative perceptions often get extended to community and formal institutional levels. The outcomes are visible in women and girls having comparatively lower levels of education and skills, income, assets, and ownership, opportunities to participate, access to information, choices and decision making abilities, and overall social and economic status in society.
Why women and girls are more vulnerable to disasters. Data on mortality from the Indian Ocean tsunami 2004 in Tamil Nadu, India, shows that the rate of mortality was higher for children, elderly, and women between 35 to 50 years. Overall, mortality rates from the Indian Ocean tsunami estimated that death rates of women were 4 times that of men. The 1991 Bangladesh cyclone-related mortality rates of women compared to men were 14 to 1. Women and girls are also subject to indirect impacts that arise in the aftermaths of disasters, such as sexual and gender-based violence, early and forced marriages, loss of livelihoods and access to education, deterioration in sexual and reproductive health, and increases in their workload, all of which compound the gender-specific impacts of disasters. In the pre-disaster phase, women's and girls' unequal access to resources, education, information, income-earning opportunities, and limitations in mobility, social and economic interactions have implications on their knowledge and awareness of hazards and disasters. Engagement in disaster preparedness is lower. Access to information, including early warning information and mobility, can be limited. In disaster emergency situations, displaced women and girls can be subject to abuse and violence. Their access to emergency assistance, including sanitary, reproductive health-related assistance, is limited. In post-disaster situations, women's access to post-disaster assistance and compensation for damages and losses is often not equal to that of disaster-affected men due to a host of issues. Limited mobility, gaps in literacy, lack of formal documentation such as a national registration or identity documents, registration of damaged houses or property in their name, bank accounts, etc. In the aftermath of the 2010 flooding in Pakistan, many women lacked mobility due to financial and familial restrictions, which limited or prevented their access to conventionally delivered aid, whether in the form of food assistance, medical services, especially reproductive health services, and even access to toilets. Many women also lacked national identification cards, which limited their ability to receive assistance from relief schemes that were predicted on the possession of an NIC. International awareness of the importance of gender in humanitarian and development programs dates back some 3 decades, and national governments and international organizations have taken important steps to incorporate gender into disaster risk management policies and programs. And yet, in almost every major disaster of the past 3 decades, there are reports of women facing discrimination or neglect in assistance or recovery planning. Gender insensitivity in disaster risk reduction can result in practical and long-term strategic implications. Therefore, it is critical to have an understanding of prevailing gender relations. Data for project planning purposes and assessments must be disaggregated by sex and age. Interventions must be informed by and based on a gender analysis of the situation using disaggregated data in order to ensure that 1. Gender-based concerns, needs, and capacities are taken into account. 2. Existing gender-based disparities are not reinforced. 3. Women's skills and capacities are recognized, with changing the prevailing negative perceptions that women are disaster victims alone, waiting for external assistance. Why do women matter in disasters? Women and girls, who account for over half of the 200 million people affected annually by natural disasters, are typically at a greater risk from natural hazards than men, particularly in low-income countries and amongst the poor. In disaster contexts around the world, women have been effective community volunteers for disaster preparedness and mitigation, search and rescues before official responders arrive, sources of community solidarity for coping after disaster, professional service providers, and political organizers for job and housing equity, amongst other roles and activities. The skills and capacities of women and girls that have accumulated through life experiences on living with and managing disaster risk are often overlooked. Significant evidence demonstrates that women are powerful agents of change during and after disasters. Yet, too often, women's contributions in recovery and reconstructions are undervalued or invisible, despite evidence that demonstrates that deeper and more sustainable recovery can be achieved when promoting gender equality and women's empowerment. Here is a summary of key observations in the discussion of why gender issues matter in disasters. We hope you gained an insight into why gender matters in disaster risk reduction, and hope to see you soon.